91.3FM. It is now time for Side by Side, where we focus on issues relating to conflict, peace, and security. I am Reverend Father Robert Achiaga, and by my side in the studio is Mr. Abubakar Akunde. Akunde, good morning. You look like you are having a wonderful day.
Good morning, Father. Thanks be to God. Thank you for having me.
Only 2 days ago, about this time, we came your way with headlines of interest and a discussion based on the topic, We Need Peace. Recall we left up on that day saying peace means harmony, and that everyone, you mean leaders, followers, everybody must take responsibility, personal responsibility, even corporate responsibility for peace in our communities, in our country, Nigeria, and in the world at large. Today we shall focus on another interesting topic, which is the dangers of conflict. The dangers of conflict. We residents in the FCT, we citizens of Nigeria, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Gbagi, Gwandara, Tiv, Idoma, Alago, Urobo, Ishan, Fulani, Muslims, Christians, adherents of traditional religion, non-believing persons, men and women, young and old, in the north, in the south, in the west, in the east, in central Nigeria, we all need to understand the dangers of conflict. As Africans, as human beings everywhere in the world, we need to realize that conflict is dangerous. It is not necessarily bad, but can have really bad outcomes. That is why we say it is dangerous. The sooner someone realizes that, the better for everyone. If you already knew this, let it inform your choices. If you did not know, then you are just about to know. We are joined in the studio by a very special guest, a public and social policy professional with so many years of experience, a consultant to UNICEF, the World Health Organization, Institute for Peace at The Hague on results-based financing, and UNESCO, name them. And above all, he is a peace-loving Nigerian, Dr. Noel Ihebuzo. Welcome and thanks for joining us, sir.
Oh, thank you, Father Robert. Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Ihebuzo will help us unpack the dangers of conflict. But before we get started on that, let us take a look at some headlines of interest bordering on conflict, peace, and security. Mr. Akunde?
Thank you, Father. As usual, I would like to begin from the foreign scene. It's no longer news, actually, that the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which started on February 24, 2022, still rages on. Yesterday, we tracked the following headlines on the foreign scene, which are related to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The first on the list is that experts fear that Vladimir Putin, feeling concerned, might resort to a new generation of smaller nuclear weapons. Also, at least 5 prisons have been attacked by Russians, according to Ukrainian officials, raising concerns for inmates. Similarly, we have China takes a backseat in international diplomacy over Ukraine. And lastly, we have Ukraine. Russia bans Instagram, Facebook, cites extremist activities. And now let's come back to Nigeria. Let's come back over to Nigeria. Of course, there are many headlines of interest, especially from the national dailies. On Monday, we had the following headlines. Number 1, over 70% of drugs dispensed in Nigeria are substandard. This wasn't said by me. The statement was credited to the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency. Also, we have touts Sean Soludo's orders attack tricycle riders over levies. We also have, we are ready for truce. IPOP tells Soludo, urges other Southeast governors to follow suit. We also have farmers' herders clashes. Afenifere faults unplanned law to make non-natives indigenous. Yesterday, we tracked the following headlines. Residents panic as gunmen threaten tougher sit-at-home enforcement. That is in Onitsha, Obosi, Nnewi, Idemili, and environs of Anambra State. Also, we have witness narrates how uncle drug-defied minor in Lagos. Similarly, we have, again, bandits raid Kaduna, Zamfara, kill 62, abduct 62 also, and raise down 70 houses. And number 4 then is cutlass-wielding Okada riders attack FCTA task force. It happened along Lugbe Airport Road. And today we read that group declare war. That is, group declares war against touts, hoodlums. The group is known as Anambra Youth Volunteers. Father, that will be all on the newspaper headlines.
Interesting. Let's begin with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, a new development of great concern. Russia threatening the use of nuclear weapons. I understand that the strategic document spelling out the conditions under which Russia may use nuclear weapons was recently updated, and it includes that the use of nuclear weapons will not just be a response approach. It can also be a first strike, but also under what conditions will it be a first strike? If the Russian nation feels that it is existentially threatened. When people suspect that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, would it be that Ukraine, the army, the leadership can become such an existential threat, or is it because the involvement of the West, Europe, NATO, the US, can become an existential threat to Russia? But it just spells out how these conflicts can get really, really bad, right?
Yes, it does indeed, Father. And I think that the information or the news attributed to the Kremlin, I would see that as a little bit more posturing than actually a real physical threat. So this, what I'll see it as, is like an escalation of the tone of violence, because there's an awareness that once you allow nuclear weaponry to come into the theater of war, you are going into a phase of what I would call mutually assured destruction.
Yes,
because what is happening is that as you escalate, the other party escalates. So actually, this threat, this verbalized threat, is more like a negotiating ploy to put pressure on the other person, on the other party, than an actual desire to apply it. Now remember too that the Russian forces are in a bit of a dicey situation, because they are mixed up with the Ukrainian population, and in the other areas where they have more or less total control, the resistance of the Ukrainians is getting stronger. Mariupol, Kiev, and all that. There's a fight back. And if you're going to now introduce nuclear weapons into this theater, you'll have to do a number of things. Pull back your own troops away from the site of the possible spread of that nuclear explosion. Be sure that the other opponent won't beat you to it. And then be sure also that you can control the conflict from escalating beyond the normal thing.
Yes, rationally, the use of nuclear weapons and even the threat of it may be considered mere posturing. But you know, my fear is Russia has brought into play a doctrine they call escalation for de-escalation. You know, U.S. used it actually when they used the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They escalated, and the war came that Japanese pulled back. And we understand that the Russians are looking to use a kind of nuclear weapon that the impact is not too wide, very focused, you know. However it happens, this only tells us how dangerous conflict is, right?
Indeed, so far it does. Because what it does show is that never you let conflict out of the bag.
Exactly.
The moment you let it out of the bag, you lose control. It's like a man riding a tiger or a woman riding a tiger. Don't get on the tiger, don't ride it. Because when that happens, a series of perceptual issues, real issues, interpretative issues, narrative issues come into play. And then another one is that a series of face-saving devices come into play. If in your projection you had felt you were going to run the place over in 1 week, and in 4 weeks you're still knocking at the corridors of Kiev, you may want to threaten something that would force the other side to back away. Conflict is bad. It generates a series of mutually accelerating and expanding and escalating theaters and manifestation of conflict, which in the end serve nobody no good. Listen to this. Each time there's conflict, it always ends on the table. In the end, after you've shot each other, bombed each other out of existence, created all the bad will in this world, you'll have to come as belligerent parties to a table and sign to your disgrace that you recognize that the fighting was unnecessary.
And I guess applied to us in Nigeria here, this means very clearly that we don't always calculate properly where conflicts will lead us. Things could really get out of hand, and so we shouldn't even get into it. Dialogue is always preferred.
Yes, I mean, the Nigerian one is also made more complex by a series of other-related issues, entitlement mentality, posturing, brinksmanship, where we're conquering people, we've outsmarted these people for so long. So it just needs one more bit of pressure before they would cease to our needs. So that is why the conflict in Nigeria, and there are quite a number of conflicts in Nigeria. The Boko Haram as a conflict, kidnapping as something you could avoid, the IPOB manifestation in the southeast, Afenifere and its dialogue of misunderstanding with the federal government. There are quite a number of areas where, unless we sat down and had a discussion, the theater of warfare, the theater of engagement may become so negative and get out of our hands that even the very stability on which this nation counts on may become eroded. And that is why it's important that those warmongers and those who posture and those who do things because they think the other side has a lesser tolerance of pain and a lesser capacity to absorb the fallouts and the negative effects of conflict. Those people should better beware, because their actions are the ones that provoke, and they had better beware. It doesn't lead us anywhere.
I'm happy you mentioned Afenifere, and it relates to the question of the piece of legislation being touted in the National House of Assembly regarding indigenship. So we understand that there are proposals that if people have settled in a state, in a community for over 5 years, they should be considered legally as indigents. This is what the Yoruba socio-cultural group are opposed to. And they relate it to the herders farmers clashes. The argument comes across this way, that in some places, extents, people who are not members of the community, who are not indigents, come, let's say herders, they sack the community through violence. The people are displaced and get to live in internally displaced people's camps. And then they settle there. Does that mean when they live there for 5 years, they automatically become indigents? What are the moral questions raised about that? What are the social problems that creates? What are the generational problems that creates? Can people live in peace that way? But do you feel the same way?
Yes, I mean, Father, I think that there are two levels of this issue. One is the intention and the method through which this piece of legislation is being brought in.
Yeah.
If indeed there's an intention to push it through. And the second one is the assumed import and impact of that legislation. This was an attempt. Remember that there was an attempt to modify the Electoral Act.
Yes.
So why do you now want to smuggle it in at the last moment, except if your intentions are not the most genuine? So people get very suspicious when on matters of one area of business is being discussed, and then you feel that's an opportune moment when everybody's not looking to sneak in this type of thing. So I think that the legislators should be very, very careful and take a proper look at the intention of those who are pushing this thing. Now, the second thing relates to what you've said. We must not be seen in this country to want to incentivize those who use force. Allowing people who appropriate by force, take over what does not belong to them, settle in, disperse original owners of the community, and then sit down there, settle in, and then after 5 years they become the owners of land. It's another way to say, come, violence pays. Whereas the whole essence of our jurisprudence is to say violence should not pay. And so we have to be very careful. I mean, I hope the legislators are aware of this, that you have to look at, when you look at legislation, you must look at the import and impact of that legislation.
Legislation should not reward those who are violent and punish those who comply with the law. Let us leave it off there. Let's take a short break. When we return, we shall go right into our discussion on the topic of the day, which is the dangers of conflict. Don't go away.